Building vulnerability assessments can be an effective tool when trying to reduce an area's vulnerability to a hazard, and specifically considering vulnerability to infrastructure. One of the highest risk hazards are earthquakes, with seismic waves proving catastrophic for any structure without preventative measures. As such, identifying what features cause greater susceptibility or may dampen the impact, and then highlighting their prevalence in a high-risk area through a building vulnerability assessment can aid in determining what improvements are required and where they need to be made. Sicily is a large island located due southwest of the southern tip of Italy. The entire region is controlled by the complex Mediterranean area, which is experiencing the slow north-northwest to south-southeast convergence of the European and African plates. This conversion results in the entire region being highly susceptible to geological hazards, primarily volcanism and seismic activity. As such, ensuring that the region's infrastructure is adaptive to these hazards is paramount for reducing vulnerability. Zafferana Etnea is a town located in northeastern Sicily. The town is located on the southwestern flank of Mount Etna, and due to this proximity, it is regularly affected by seismic hazards originating from both tectonic movement and volcanic activity. Previous building assessments within this region have proved the effectiveness of this approach, with a residential building assessment in Solano demonstrating how this data can be used to produce vulnerability statistics as well as simulate damage scenarios within GIS. This report will detail how a visual inspection building assessment could be undertaken within Zafferana Etnea, considering possible outcomes as well as potential validation methods if the methodology was to be applied in the field. When an area is regularly affected by a seismic hazard, the risk for structural damage is high. As such, assessing an area's infrastructure to ascertain the vulnerability can help reduce the damage and overall impact in the event of an earthquake. The aim for this presentation is to detail the methodology that can be used to perform a building vulnerability assessment for the town of Zafferana Etnea by using virtual inspection techniques with secondary data sources. The first objective for this aim is to identify and detail structural features which would indicate a lower vulnerability to seismic hazards. This will include features such as construction material, overhangs, and soft stories. Once these features have been detailed, they can be compared to example structures within Zafferana Etnea. These will be examined using secondary data available within Google Earth. This will then give an overview of the general vulnerability of the entire region. To support this, a comparison to a local and national building code pertaining to seismic vulnerability can be made. This will highlight any shortcomings of the buildings within Zafferana Etnea, primarily if they follow the guidelines placed to reduce building vulnerability or choose to omit them. Additionally, this presentation will highlight how the nearby town of Fleury, whose infrastructure was severely damaged by an earthquake in 2018, could be used to validate the data if the investigation was to be carried out in the field.
Zafferana Etnea is extremely susceptible to tectonic and volcanic seismicity due to its proximity to Mount Etna, known to be one of the most active volcanoes in the world. The town's tectonic setting is linked to the convergence of the Eurasian and African plates, which results in the region being earthquake-prone. It is difficult to distinguish between volcanic and tectonic seismicity, but it is commonly understood that the volcanic seismicity usually occurs in swarms compared to the one-off events of tectonic seismicity. For this study, the focus is not on the type of seismicity, but the damaging effects that occur from both, i.e. the ground shaking causing building damage. Zafferana Etnea comes in the top 4 municipalities for seismic risk in the region. Therefore, it is important to understand the risk that seismicity poses in the town. More importantly, as buildings are known to be the biggest killer in seismically active regions, it is even more important to understand the risk that buildings in the town pose to the population. Following an earthquake in the Abruzzo region on April 6, 2009, 18,000 buildings were left unusable, posing imminent risk to residents due to the instability and vulnerability of structures caused by ground movement. Therefore, building vulnerability assessments are deemed essential to local and regional authorities as they can inform prevention and mitigation methods and building codes and guidelines in seismically active areas, reducing risk to residents. Consequently, a framework was created to assess building vulnerability in Zafferana Etnea. There are several factors that can lead to buildings being vulnerable during an earthquake. These include the number of stories, the presence of soft stories, overhangs, short columns, topography, quality of construction, and building maintenance. The importance of these factors and the framework used to assess the buildings will be explained in a later section. In addition to the factors already listed, building codes can play an important role in the building's vulnerability. In a report of the Western Sicily earthquake of 1968, it was stated that there were no anti-earthquake regulations in the building codes, and the old buildings in the village were readily subject to collapse. Therefore, the 1974 Italian building codes were introduced. They were mainly based on stress designs, and the approach was guided by zonation. Yet when they were enforced in 1984, it left 2/3 of the country without seismic provisions, most likely because approximately 60% of the current building stock was built between the 1950s and 1980s, before the introduction of building codes. In 1998, a new zonation guide was proposed, but never adopted. During the 2002 magnitude 5.7 earthquake in southern Italy, many cities close to the epicentre were severely damaged, including a collapse of a primary school causing 27 casualties. This forced the Italian government to create a new set of seismic provisions. As a consequence, the 2003-2004 building codes were introduced. The preliminary zonation was based on the forgotten 1998 map. This map demonstrated that much of Sicily was deemed at medium risk, with pockets of high risk towards the east. Despite these newly enforced building codes, many buildings across Italy do not follow the codes and are deemed unsafe during seismic events. A personal account from John Cahey in 2011 stated that during a visit to Noto, a southern-eastern Sicilian town, the locals, when asked about the building codes, shrugged their shoulders and claimed rules are bent and zonation laws, if they exist, are ignored. As shown by the graph, Italy, despite being a seismically active country, enforced moderate and high seismic design codes much later than other European countries. The following diagram demonstrates the proportion of Italian buildings that were built with no seismic design codes in mind, suggesting a combination of an ignorance of the codes, implied by Cahey, and that a large proportion of the Italians' building stock predated the introduction of building codes. Many of the buildings in Zafferana Etnea are made from concrete, with the majority being 2 or 3 stories high. However, there are several exceptions. This will be explained in detail later, using examples in the framework, and the framework will be implemented to indicate building vulnerability risk scores. This section has covered the context and rationale for choosing Zafferana Etnea as the study site in relation to seismicity, why seismic risk is important to examine in relation to building vulnerability within the context of Sicily, and finally, the main factors that influence vulnerability and why building codes, or the lack of, can have an effect in seismically active regions. The following section will cover the vulnerability parameters in more detail and explain how theoretically the framework operates.
To conduct a building vulnerability assessment for Zafferana Etnea, it was decided to develop and utilise a framework. This framework can be completed by conducting a street survey and completing the assessment on several houses within the town to get an overview of the different levels of building vulnerability. This was created using similar frameworks from other European countries such as Turkey that have a similar building stock to Zafferana Etnea. Each assessment starts with a score of 100 and the score reduction parameters are subtracted accordingly. These score parameters were chosen based on literature and have been proven to be good indicators of a building's vulnerability. The score reductions change with the number of stories, as this will allow a variation in the building vulnerability scores, allowing for a better distribution across the vulnerability categories. The building material will also be captured, as this will allow for further analysis as to whether the scores given are an accurate representation of the differing level of risk dependent on building technology. The number of stories is included because the height of the building is important, as it directly relates to the weight of the structures and the response to ground motion. The natural frequency of a building is low for tall buildings and high for short buildings. Increasing the number of stories increases the seismic forces linearly, whereas the seismic resistances do not follow in adequate proportions. Therefore, the damage normally increases linearly with the number of stories. The comparison of the behaviour between the two building heights can be seen in the diagram. Soft story behaviour, seen in the diagram, has been recognised as one of the most undesirable mechanisms among the structural and earthquake engineering society. This effect occurs when the ground story has less stiffness and strength compared to upper stories. The upper stories benefit from additional stiffness and strength provided by partition walls, but the commercial or garage space at the bottom is mostly left open between the frame members, Pancake soft stories are seen all over the world when earthquakes strike, as the ground stories have a different axis system which causes irregularity, causing the building to be more prone to collapse. Heavy overhangs are included in the assessment as the presence of a large balcony or overhanging floor causes increments on earthquake forces and overturning moments during earthquakes. They create irregularity in the floor slab, which causes large deflections under earthquake motion. Short columns attract forces more than tall columns, as seen in the diagram, which means there is less resistance to deformation. If a short column is not adequately designed for a large force, then there can be significant damage sustained, which is known as the short column effect. It is suggested that a short column increases the shear force value 8 times comparative with relative tall columns. When there is not a sufficient clearing between adjacent buildings, they pound each other during an earthquake as a result of different vibration periods and consequent non-synchronized vibration amplitudes. The diagram shows the different pounding impacts that can be present depending on the arrangement of the adjacent buildings. Buildings subjected to pounding receive heavier damages at higher stories. The topography of the street can influence the ground motion intensity, especially on the top of the hills. This can have a significant impact on the vibration experienced by the building, which can increase the amount of damage that can occur. This is especially the case on slopes deeper than 30 degrees. Buildings on these slopes usually have stock foundations which are incapable of distributing the ground distortions evenly to structural members. A building's vulnerability can be increased when the quality of the building is poor or not maintained appropriately, as seen in the table, which shows examples of the different building quality and conditions that can be present. The material, workmanship, and maintenance status of a building indicate the apparent quality of a construction. Therefore, the assessment considers the visual quality of the building because it can be suggested that those buildings that have clearly visible cracks or structural failures of roofs, floors, or walls are more prone to damage or complete collapse if an earthquake was to occur. This section has highlighted the 7 parameters chosen which symbolise the vulnerability of most buildings that may potentially have to withstand an earthquake. The next section will demonstrate how this framework can be used to determine the vulnerability of several different buildings across Zafferana Etnea. Each building will have a vulnerability score calculated, which will be compared to the others to give an indication of the level of risk across the town. Within Zafferana Etnea, the predominant building material is concrete, with some including the use of steel reinforcements. However, although this is the dominant type, due to the stepwise development which occurs in towns such as this, different building materials and types are introduced which impacts the building's vulnerability. Following a virtual recce to the town, this stepwise development is clear, with several exceptions to the predominant 2 or 3 story concrete house generally seen outside of the central part of the town. When applying the framework to the 3-story concrete house, as shown here, the presence of 3 stories leads to a score reduction of 5. There is a soft story, a large overhang, and large balconies, which leads to score reductions. In addition, the structure is located next to 2 single-story structures, which therefore has a pounding effect on these buildings and on itself, compromising its stability during an earthquake. The building is not located on a steep slope, and the visual quality is deemed to be good, with no visual damage or structural defects, with no further score reductions. Using the framework, the overall score for this building is 84, therefore considered to be a low vulnerability building. Of this building type, there are some taller buildings, up to 5 stories, as shown here, which, although are still constructed from concrete, the height has a significant influence on the vulnerability, which is accounted for within the framework. This building's vulnerability score is worsened due to the presence of a soft story and heavy overhangs in the form of balconies on each level. Due to the presence of a 3-story building either side of the building, the pounding effect will negatively impact the structure during an earthquake. Based on the presence of these features, the building's overall score using the framework is 52, and consequently is a higher vulnerability in comparison to the 3-story building, predominantly due to the influence of the number of stories. Another exception to the concrete building is that what are believed to be the original building type, which are constructed from stone. Based on the use of Google Earth, the few buildings of this material remaining within the town are only single-story, as shown here. The building is single-story, and the only score reduction parameters present is within the visual quality of the building, which is deemed to be poor. There are visible structural defects such as missing stones from the load-bearing walls and evidence of vegetation between the walls and the roof, indicating possible impacts to the structure. These features suggest a lack of regular or any maintenance and highlight the probable age of these buildings. Based on the features identified, the building receives an overall score of 93, suggesting a low vulnerability due to the lack of most of the score reduction parameters. Another building type seen are constructed from concrete columns and floors presumed to be reinforced with brick infill and facade, as shown here. This particular building's vulnerability is increased due to there being 3 stories, a large soft story, a large overhang and heavy balconies. The building is located on a steep slope which will impact its vulnerability further. However, the overall condition of the building looks good with no visible cracks or defects. Based on the features identified, this building receives a score of 84, which is a low vulnerability. However, if the concrete is reinforced, then the overall vulnerability will be lower than one which is made from unreinforced concrete. Towards the outskirts of the town, there are several newly built buildings, which are 2 stories, as shown. This building's vulnerability is compromised due to the presence of a large balcony. However, there are no other score reduction parameters present, as the building is in good condition. It does not have a soft story and is also detached and more than 1 metre from the closest building, and therefore will not be impacted by the pounding effect. Overall, the building receives a score of 94, suggesting the building has a very low vulnerability. Overall, as shown within the section, there are variations in terms of the building materials used and variations in terms of the number of stories and presence of different features such as overhangs and soft stories. This leads to a range of building vulnerabilities across the town, which are evident from the calculation of the scores for the 5 buildings assessed. The importance of building material has been highlighted and should be considered as the 1-story stone building has the second lowest vulnerability. However, using existing knowledge, this is more vulnerable due to the age of the building and the use of stone. Therefore, although there are several parameters influencing building vulnerability, this assessment has highlighted that the building material is key to be incorporated.
Faye et al. 2012 highlighted that the underlying assumptions associated with vulnerability assessments indicate the need for a validation. Consenza et al. 2018 used the technique of applying a seismic vulnerability framework to 3 case study locations with similar building stocks. This same theory was applied to this framework, so a validation could be completed of the building vulnerability categories and outputs. On the 26th of December 2018, a magnitude 4.8 earthquake with a depth of 1.2 kilometres hit the municipality of Zafferana Etnea, causing serious building damage in the village of Faye. Several hundred people were evacuated from the area with significant damage to homes as well as historically and artistically important structures. Faye has a history of seismic activity, with 2 strong earthquakes occurring in October 1984, which caused extensive damage to building structures, which can be seen from these images. 70% of them were subsequently declared uninhabitable. However, many individuals remained and carried on living in these structures. It can therefore be deduced that most structures in Faye were constructed prior to the updated 2003/4 building codes, similar to those in Zafferana Etnea. Images of the damage caused by the 2018 earthquake can be collected online from newspaper articles and reports, or within certain regions of Faye on Google Earth, depending on the date of the data. These images can be geo-referenced using specific landmarks to allow a comparison of building structures before and after the event. For example, a key landmark in Faye is the Chiesa Maria, seen here. By comparing Google images from before and after the event, the damage caused by the earthquake can be identified. To validate whether the vulnerability factors in the framework are accurate and appropriate, the buildings identified as high or low risk in Zafferana Etnea would be compared to those damaged in Faye. For example, the consideration of soft stories in the original framework could be validated using examples of buildings with this characteristic which experienced considerable damage from the earthquake, as evidenced through the structure. The validation in Faye would also provide insight into possible adaptations of the framework to make it more accurate. For example, in Zafferana Etnea, the framework deduced a score of 197 for this house, indicating a relatively low vulnerability. However, images of Faye's damage highlights how buildings constructed with stone experience considerable damage compared to the concrete structures adjacent. As you can see here, overlaps of the periods these images were taken allow a comparison of before and after the earthquake, signifying the level of damage the stone structure experienced compared to adjacent concrete structures. These images of the stone structure help reinforce this analysis, indicating that stone structures are considerably more vulnerable to seismic events than the framework suggested. This highlights that a possible adaptation to the framework would be to acknowledge the greater influence of the construction types and materials of buildings, as this was not majorly considered in the original framework. Based off analysis in Faye, it could be concluded that building vulnerability would be better assessed by categorising groups of buildings based off construction types and materials. This could be added to the qualitative aspect of the framework as presented earlier to allow a description of materials and show whether there are any similarities with the construction type and other vulnerability factors. This would allow an understanding of how different constructions and materials influence the vulnerability of buildings. The validation of the framework could also provide insight into what improvements or alterations there could be. Faye et al. 2012 stated that an accurate framework should be flexible and allow refinements and adjustments during input. By evaluating the buildings damaged in Fleury, analysis of common building features or characteristics amongst the structures that failed or not could be identified and annotated as a possible refinement to a future framework.
In conclusion, the aims and objectives of this project have been met by understanding the building vulnerability within Zafferana Etnea. The use of a framework has highlighted the need for the inclusion of building material as part of building vulnerability. Buildings constructed from what are deemed to be stronger, more resistant materials can obtain a higher vulnerability due to the presence of additional features compared to materials known to be more vulnerable. Within the town, the building stock is generally very similar, with the majority of buildings made of concrete, with small variations in the score reduction parameters such as balconies and soft stories. Therefore, the vulnerability can be said to be relatively high across the town due to the lack of significant variation. To understand the level of vulnerability further, this assessment could be carried out on a larger number of buildings to gain a better overview of the building vulnerability as a result of seismic activity.